You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 328 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about how U.S. mercenaries ended up getting arrested at the Haitian Central Bank, and then how the U.S. State Department helped them to avoid charges. Taiwan is looking for a major weapons buy from the United States, and this will likely have big impact on the U.S. and Chinese relations. And then the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, mostly the Syrian Kurds, have declared victory over the Islamic State or the Islamic Caliphate in Syria. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. I know a lot of you are doing this because the audience is definitely growing. So thank you for those of you who take the time to, and anytime you could do it, it really does help. So libertarianinstitute.org is the best place to find the show online. My daily news roundup is also featured there. You can also find the show on pretty much any of the podcatcher kind of apps. And make sure you subscribe to the show because I do try to update current event news stories from show to show. And last, if you could donate to the show on patreon.com, you would get access to some bonus content. All right, the first story I have today is from the Rolling Stone, and it is about the Pentagon accounting, or kind of lack of accounting. It's a pretty long article, so I'm just going to highlight a few of the little stories from the article and then kind of point out the bigger problem that they expose. So the first story is about a congressman who came into office in, I believe, like 85, and kind of looked at the Pentagon accounting, I think was like, what the hell is going on? This guy wasn't apparently some, Washington insider. He had worked at golf clubs and accounting firms. He was just kind of a normal guy, I guess. And then there's a couple little scandals surrounding some budget things, and everybody went to him, and, he, I think, along with Chuck Grassley, started to work on some legislation that was supposed to get an audit of the Pentagon. Well, 30 years almost have passed, and we still really don't have any complete audit of the Pentagon. And in there, they look at all the different examples of when the Pentagon swore absolutely in 2 years and 3 years, we will be ready for this audit, and how they've spent billions of dollars over the course of this time getting prepared for the audit. I think this is a legitimate thing that happens, like businesses will bring in firms to kind of help them find the receipts they need, or, square up any accounting problems that may have happened before like being audited for a legal reason or by the government. But, they've spent all this money and still haven't even turned up an audit. Now, when audits of portions of the Pentagon have happened, they have, turned up major problems. I, recently discussed the $2.1 billion. I believe mostly this was just an F-35 parts that nobody had tracked. And basically right now the government is just hoping that Lockheed Martin is going to open up their books and show them the receipts, or else, who knows and what's been lost. Another story goes along like this, that some weapons were loaded onto a B-52 and flown from one side of the country to the other. It wasn't until after the pilots landed that they realized they were carrying nuclear bombs. And this was a pretty big deal because they didn't think they were carrying nuclear weapons. And this happened because apparently the Air Force doesn't have a very good scanning system, tracking system, so that, when you look at bots, you scan it like you do at any grocery store, and information about that product comes up. Apparently that doesn't happen in the Air Force, and it's problematic across all kinds of different branches of the military. And so, the article raises questions about at times the Pentagon losing track of actual buildings, not knowing can they account for all the buildings that they claim to be there, and just all these problems that you wouldn't even think could exist. Losing track of buildings, losing track of nukes. At one point they sent Taiwan, I believe, a cap for a nuclear warhead instead of an attack helicopter. I mean, these are cartoonish mistakes being made by the military. But, it's not just the tracking systems that aren't consistent across the Pentagon. It really seems to be everything. You read portions of the story in here. I really got to talk to an accountant and have them like explain this to me, what it means. But apparently, like at the end of months, like there's just Pentagon accountants who like wash away their problems. Like, all right, we're starting over from the next month. Everything lined up and it worked out. Now, from the standpoint of a libertarian, I'm obviously opposed to this because it's wasting a huge amount of our money and wealth. And there's so many people who could do so many amazing things with the wealth that's being absolutely wasted and squandered because the Pentagon doesn't know what parts they have or where they are and doesn't track their money at all. So there's all kinds of corruption. And so I'm sure everybody listening to this show could think of all the terrible things that are being wasted with this money, and how because of this poor accounting, it allows for so much corruption, which funnels and fuels the military industrial complex. Right. But from the standpoint of somebody who's supportive of the military, they may oppose this article and be like, oh, you can't criticize the military. But think about how problematic it would be if, in their wildest dreams, China decides to invade mainland the United States after forming a secret alliance with Russia, and they're trying to land on the shores of California. If then the Pentagon and the Air Force can't transfer the right bombs and shipments, if, they're trying to transfer some nukes and attack helicopters arrive, well, that's a really big problem. And so I would think that the, pro-military people, the Hawks, would be the ones most opposed to this problem. I guess maybe that's one decent thing you could say about Chuck Grassley. All right, so that article's in the show notes page. Another news update here from the United States. Chelsea Manning, who, for those of consistent listeners of the show, know that she's back in jail for refusing to testify in front of a federal grand jury without her defense. She invoked several of her constitutional rights to the First, Fourth, and Sixth Amendments and was denied all of them, and has been now placed in solitary confinement in jail for a period of time that we really don't know what it is. Whenever I hear any analysis on this issue, and I've tried to listen to a lot of it, I hope people are checking out the Unity for Julian visuals that happen every Friday, 4 to 7 East Coast time, typically hosted by Elizabeth Voss and Joe Loria. Features great guests, John Kiriakou, Gareth Porter. People don't know exactly how long Chelsea Manning could be detained for refusing to testify, and it seems that it really could be indefinite. There are some, legal challenges that she has lined up here to try to get out of it. She's even offered, going under house arrest, and at least that way be able to receive, necessary medical and psychiatric treatment. But, the government rejects that, and because I guess Chelsea Manning is associated with WikiLeaks and, in the past leaked information that she was granted clemency for, went on trial, was convicted, granted clemency, and they want to ask her more questions about this time. It was a very extensive investigation, as her legal team has pointed out, and there's nothing that they can't get from that first trial. And, granting Chelsea Manning the ability to have representation at this hearing or for it to be public would maybe be things that would make her willing to testify, I guess, to clear up anything they don't know. So again, this is absolutely a heroic effort by Chelsea Manning in solitary confinement, indefinite period of time, definitely to me makes it a torture situation. And so you can kind of look at that right now the U.S. government is attempting to torture Chelsea Manning to get her to testify likely against Julian Assange. A couple of her solitary confinement conditions that really stand out are no reading materials in the cell, 22 hours a day in the cell. They do say she's receiving all necessary medical treatment, which is good to hear. However, I guess her time out of the cell is between like 1 and 3 a.m., which has to be, just making it a difficult situation even more difficult. And what they're doing here is absolutely disgusting. I can't imagine what it's like for Chelsea to be locked in that cell for 22 hours a day. But, make sure that if you're the kind of person that supports things like this, you get some support to Chelsea Manning. All right, on to this Haiti situation, which I talked about on the show when it broke, and I had a lot of questions, and some really good reporting from the Intercept, I think, possibly gives us the answers. So the general plot that the Intercept lays out here is that the president of Haiti, and Haiti has a government power sharing agreement with a president and a prime minister, was looking to gain access to some funds that could only be accessed, I guess, jointly by the president and prime minister. And there's some, political contention there. There's protests in Haiti demanding the president step down. And so in an attempt to get access to this, the president contacted the cutout, offered him a major contract in Haiti in exchange for that cutout transferring $80 million from this account to another one. So what happens here is that the cutout contacts an American, hires him along with, I believe, 3 other Americans and 2 Serbians, and the 6 of them get heavily armed and go to Haiti, where they meet the cutout and then attempt to go to the bank and I believe just transfer this $80 million in funds. From my reading, I don't think this was necessarily like a bank heist job where they were going to get this money out. They get to the bank, it's not open, security guard's there, the guy goes and tries to get the security guard to let him in, the security guard calls the police, and the police come, there's a standoff there. I guess the cutout escapes or flees the scene of the standout somehow, but the other 6 are arrested. Then the State Department pulled some strings, and the president of Haiti is a more favorable leader, you know, from the American eye, got these 6 people moved to Miami, where then the U.S. announced they wouldn't face charges, and so I guess they get wiped their hands of this. Maybe $10,000 richer, that's what they say they were paid. I think they were promised $20,000 on the back end. Guessing they're not going to get that. There's a couple interesting things here. The article points out that this plot wasn't planned out very well. They arrived to the central bank with apparently no plan to how to get into the bank, or they didn't know what time it opened. Either way, it's a pretty serious mistake. I think at least they would have bribed the guard on duty beforehand. Once there, the police are contacted. They don't, from my understanding, try to flee the scene. There's no kind of shootout or anything with police. After a long standoff, I guess they just leave or, you know, get arrested and detained, you know, but willingly give up. And then there's some political ramifications apparently in Haiti. This has sparked some protests as it, you know, really appears that the U.S. is flexing their muscle over Haiti. Now, even if the U.S. government wasn't behind this, you know, from a position here, you could see how it would definitely look like the president of Haiti, backed by the United States, gets a cutout who then contacts Americans who then come and try to rob their central bank. You know what I mean? Like, American hands are all over this. And then once they were caught and cornered, the president worked with the Americans to get them sent back to the United States. I think the last interesting note I had on this story is that this account in particular was apparently part of a Venezuela program where I think they really did give sweetheart deals to some Latin American countries as far as oil goes. Pretty cheap oil and, you know, at loans that weren't very expensive. And so I guess, you know, when we look at the world and think, well, how could anybody, you know, be a socialist or support the Venezuelan government? Well, from the perspective of the people of Haiti, you know, the Venezuelans are giving them some wealth and the Americans are sending armed thugs to try to rob them. Taiwan news. Taiwan has announced through their budgetary process that they're looking at buying over 100 tanks from the U.S. and then over 60 F-16s. I believe it's the SE F-16 variant. Eventually we'll get some dollar signs on this and could give you numbers if the process continues to move ahead here. This pretty quickly drew condemnation from China, who of course sees Taiwan as being a part of China, just as more or less an act of rebellion, whereas the Taiwanese people consider themselves an independent state. You know, I had to do some reading here coming up on how capable the Taiwanese military is to defend themselves without dragging the United States into the war. If, let's say, China attempted an invasion, could Taiwan repel it or not? I really don't know. They do have a very American high-tech military. You know, they've received a lot of different weapons from the United States, so certainly it's not like these are defenseless people. However, you know, China is a major power now and has developed, I believe, a 5th-generation aircraft and has some, you know, pretty high-tech weapons of their own that they look to use to repel the Americans and then could possibly use to invade Taiwan as well. From the position of the Taiwanese, I do see a perspective where China has definitely taken steps over the past few years to try to isolate Taiwan diplomatically. They've done this in part through their Belt and Road Initiative and also just giving different types of agreements around Africa where African countries have then gone as far as, you know, changed the labeling of Taiwan on their airports to being, you know, a Chinese flag. That said, I haven't read anything that makes me think, invasion anytime soon. China does take some provocative actions as far as, conducting military drills and stuff like that I'm sure is in part intended to intimidate Taiwan. So I think the kind of interesting thing here when I read this story is I'm not sure if Taiwan is buying a military or they're buying the U.S. military. Now, one possibility is they're actually trying to create a defense force here. And that's why they're building this, buying this, because they think they're then going to be able to repel the Chinese. On the other hand, and what I think is much more likely, what they're doing here is trying to buy the U.S. support. And so by giving the U.S. defense industry $5 billion in business, they know that industry will then produce reports that say is absolutely necessary for the U.S. to guarantee Taiwanese independence from China 100%. And you'll get more and more reports from that from different think tanks. And these, defense makers will then, go to congressmen. They'll say, hey, here's a $5,000 check because I really support you. And I want to talk to you about this issue, China and Taiwan. And I think the U.S. really needs this, pro-Taiwanese independence policy. And this is how they push different policies. And so, it's confusing as to what Taiwan is actually buying here. But the obvious problem is potential conflict with China, which the U.S. is taking all kinds of other stupid steps with the tariffs and the provocations in the South China Sea. Now, look, maybe China really is overreaching by trying to take the South China Sea and Taiwan. I'm not discounting that. The problem is that the U.S. should not be dragged into war with it, especially a war with another nuclear superpower. Well, nuclear power, I don't know if you put super in front of that quite yet. One thing that does support the influence argument is the U.S. is carrying out more and more of these operations where they sail ships through the Taiwan Strait. Another one just happened. I'm worried that it's only a matter of time before China actually does try to put on a similar or competing show or interfere with this U.S. mission. And so, again, I don't think any impending war quite yet here, but there are steps towards escalation that don't need to be happening. Some big news is that Donald Trump proclaimed the Golan Heights to be Israeli territory. It's getting a lot of media attention, much more than most typical stories about the Middle East. A couple interesting aspects of this story and places where I, feel I have a little bit more knowledge because I'm not exactly, an expert or anything on the history of the Golan Heights and how that changed hands and exactly what I think about all the wars and things going on since. But you had just a few weeks ago, Lindsey Graham visiting Israel and talking to Benjamin Netanyahu about the U.S. and wanting to talk to Donald Trump about recognizing the Golan Heights as Israeli territory, and a few weeks later it absolutely happens. Another problem here is that this is going to be imposed at the UN. The UN Charter says that nations can't change their borders by force, and then, they can't occupy that territory. And that's really what, has effectively what happened here is even if you say that the Arab states started the war and Israel only seized this territory in response, well, you're still seizing territory through force. And I from my understanding, there's a population of the Golan Heights that are not really Israeli. And so they're essentially occupied people in the Golan Heights. Just like this, South China Sea and Taiwan stuff, this is something I'm still learning about. So I don't want to talk too much about who should really control the Golan Heights because, I don't really have the answer to that. I'm sure in the, coming weeks, I'll be able to hear, great analysts, Scott Horn, Joanne Leone, the Ron Paul Liberty Report, and they'll talk about this issue and I'll gain a little bit more insight. But this isn't being accepted at the UN, and Turkey has said they'll fight it at the UN as well. And that even creates an interesting dynamic where, Turkey has been pretty opposed to Syria throughout the Syrian civil war and, at times invading the Syrian state and supporting jihadist types groups in Syria against the Syrian state. But now, Israel is kind of taking claim and the U.S. is backing the Israelis taking claim to Syrian territory, and Turkey is standing up to that. I know the Golan Heights is a pretty strategic position, especially as it, I guess, overlooks the Damascus and a lot of the Israeli population areas. And so there's a reason Israel wants to, I think, state their permanent claim to this area. Elsewhere, we have increased fighting in Gaza. about 2 weeks ago, I think, a Hamas rocket was fired into Tel Aviv, and I believe it's just one rocket. At times I've seen them try to claim that this was an Iranian rocket. At times I've seen claims that this was an accident. Either way, it was a really, I think, big deal, or at least made to be one by the Israeli state, who's responded with lots of airstrikes in Gaza. And then we start to see Hamas return fire. And one significant thing is that these rockets penetrated pretty deep into Israel, 120 miles, so they usually don't go that far, from my understanding. Now, luckily, at least the fighting since the weekend up until Monday, no one has been killed. 7 civilians on each side have been injured. And, just like the situation with Golan, the situation in Gaza is a real mess. And the most unfortunate thing, and the thing that needs to be addressed first, is that Gaza is quickly becoming uninhabitable. There's lots of people who live in Gaza who desperately need to be able to import the kind of resources that they need to survive. And right now, it's Israel and other countries that are preventing that from happening, and really needs to be addressed in sometime soon. Now, there's all kinds of other problems, like Hamas firing rockets into Israel, and the Palestinians aren't just innocent victims who never did anything wrong. And, there's certainly been violence from the Palestinian side, but right now, it's the Israelis who are choking off Gaza. And it's certainly probably one of the most urgent problems in the world that needs to be addressed. Next to Yemen, where a couple interesting stories. Saudi Arabia carried out airstrikes against the Houthis, I think in northwestern Houthi territory there, killing about 50. And then the city of Taiz, which is controlled generally by the coalition government, but apparently some fighting broke out between coalition factions. The Al-Islah, or Muslim Brotherhood, supported by Saudi Arabia, ISIS al-Qaeda supported by the Emirati side. So there's a pretty crazy story going on with some North Korean sanctions. It appears that the Treasury Department identified some ships or Chinese companies that were violating UN sanctions against North Korea, and was then going to apply sanctions to that company or ship. And then Trump came out and said that we're not doing that because I'm friends with Chairman Kim. So, of course, this invited a whole bunch of scrutiny about how, Donald Trump just loves Kim Jong-un and all this nonsense. But the good thing here is this seems to be, for the first time in a while, even if it's just not putting on more sanctions against North Korea, some kind of somewhat favorably positive news here. So hopefully this gets built upon, and maybe Donald Trump realizes that, peace plays well with the U.S. people, and, coming up to 2020, things aren't going so well with the wall. Hey, maybe I could sign a peace treaty here with the North Koreans. In Afghanistan, 2 U.S. soldiers were killed. Still haven't found the details on that yet, so I'll talk about that when I get more. We also had the death of 14 Afghan civilians, and this was apparently because of an Taliban insider attack, where Taliban infiltrated the Afghan army and then opened fire on U.S. and Taliban forces. The U.S. responded with an airstrike that then kills 14 civilians. I've read time and time again that these insider attacks that the Taliban carries out are particularly destructive towards any kind of trust building that could happen between the U.S. and the Afghan army. It creates real problems. The Syrian Democratic Forces, the Syrian Kurds, have declared victory over the Islamic Caliphate in Syria. I don't know what this actually means. It probably means something different to the Syrian Kurds than it does to the United States. We pretty much say that we're still staying, and I have no idea how many troops are staying. It could be 1,000. Dunford said that report's wrong. Didn't say it's only going to be 200 or 400, and it certainly doesn't look like we're withdrawing everybody anymore. And we continue to hear from the Trump administration, from the military, that ISIS remains an ongoing threat that we need to do something about. I'm not sure if for the Syrian Kurds that means that they're kind of done fighting in this area closer, kind of south, central Syria along the Euphrates River, and only more concerned about, their territory of Syria, or if they're going to continue to fight, this counterinsurgency mission and really lead that against ISIS in this area. I think there's a lot of questions about how the actual U.S. policy and tactics are going to change on the ground now in Syria, especially depending how the Syrian Kurds respond to this. But I really can't say or have any clue of how this is, all going to play out moving forward, other than looks like the U.S. is staying for some time. Last up on today's show, I just wanted to, kind of round up by saying again, man, this Mueller report is something, and the reaction to it. It's clear now that there's no collusion between Trump and Russia, and so, there's no more charges, no more indictments coming there. At best, at this point, you have some left, Democratic Rachel Maddow type commentators who are kind of clinging to these obstruction charges, but generally it seems that the Russiagate narrative has failed. Now, I do know that the whole, Russia had the election claims are still going on, and, the claim that they used GRU agents in the IRA, the Internet Research Agency, to facilitate social media campaign to sway voters, but that's, been debunked thoroughly, especially by Gareth Porter and some of the great work he's done. So this, Russiagate narrative, really last nail in the coffin as far as I see it. If the full Mueller report comes out, it comes out. I'll read through it, and then, maybe I'll do a final wrap-up show on the whole thing. But, hopefully this is the end of Russiagate. There's 3 articles I want to recommend that I think are some of the best responses to this whole thing. Peter Van Buren writing at the American Conservative, Matt Taibbi at his own blog, and Caitlin Johnstone, I believe, at Medium. And I'll link to those 3 episodes in the show notes page. Of course, if you read the daily news roundup at the Libertarian Institute, you have already seen those. So anyways, everybody, I appreciate everything you do for the show, sharing it, listening to it, recommending it to people. I hope I'm bringing you the news that you want to hear. Always let me know. Give me your feedback. Share the show if you can. Recommend it. And I don't know. I think I'm rambling on here. But always check out my website, immersionnews.com.